Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And a question we were recently asked was, at what point did aircraft carriers render battleships obsolete? Before I answer, you should drop your answer in the comment section down below. My answer is that aircraft carriers have yet to render battleships obsolete. They cannot fully do the job of battleships. Obviously, battleships are vulnerable to attack by aircraft carriers. Several of them are sunk. Also, aircraft carriers are vulnerable to attack by battleships. At least 2 carriers have been sunk by battleships. I will not try to argue that aircraft carriers are not the queen of the fleet, nor that they should be the queen of the fleet. Their ability to project power over vast distances greatly exceeds that of the battleship. However, while they can dominate a sea zone, they cannot permanently contest it, and they cannot control a sea zone. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, but first, a word from our sponsors. For today's video, our sponsor is Magic Spoon cereal. Magic Spoon fits a variety of diets, is high protein, and has no sugar. Magic Spoon is an easy source of protein. It makes it so convenient for me to eat more protein when I'm too busy or tired to cook. Magic Spoon tastes just like the cereal we loved as kids. The most popular flavors are fruity, cocoa, frosted, peanut butter, but there are many more. Today, I'm eating cinnamon roll. As a grade school kid, I used to eat cereal on my days off just before building model ships. As an adult kid, I eat it for lunch while working on my 1-to-1 scale model ship. But I don't have to feel bad about eating children's cereal because every serving of Magic Spoon has 13 to 14 grams of protein, 0 grams of sugar, and 4 to 5 grams of net carbs, so you can feel good about what you're eating. Check the link in the description below, or go to magicspoon.com/battleship and use the discount code BATTLESHIP on your next order. Aircraft carriers developed out of the battle cruiser concept. They do a lot of the same jobs in that they're scouting, they're launching attacks, but they aren't really armored well enough to take a hit. Their magazines and their aviation gasoline and their weapon systems, in this case their air group, is incredibly vulnerable when it's on board the ship. So damage in the form of bombs, missiles, or shells can potentially set that off, if not destroying the carrier, then at least mission killing it and forcing it out of the combat zone. Much like the battle cruisers that they grew out of, aircraft carriers are most effective either in uncontested waters, such as many of the smaller wars, smaller only in that they're not as big as a world war, that the United States has fought since World War II. In that fighting countries like Korea or Vietnam, those countries do not have navies to contest the aircraft carriers' control of the sea. If there were navies to contest the aircraft carriers could not hold station the way that they have since World War II. More like World War II, they would have to go into an area secretly, launch a massive alpha strike to destroy enemy installations. Maybe if they've destroyed enough, they can loiter for a couple of days, but after a little over a week of combat operations, they've typically attrited their air group to the point that they have to retreat. So they cannot control a sea zone. They cannot permanently occupy an area to keep the enemy from coming back into it. And that's one of many jobs that battleships did still do during World War II and could still do today. One of the coolest things for us living now 80 years after World War II is that we've had several generations of historians writing about the war. It's been argued that early generations of historians really played up the value of aircraft carriers and submarines. That's not to detract from carriers and submarines. They were hugely successful during World War II. And especially when you consider the immediate post-war era, when the various services were competing over very small funding in an era when folks thought that all future wars would be nuclear, the Navy really had to put forward its best assets to say that they were going to be necessary in a post-war world. And so carriers and submarines make sense, especially when you consider that in that post-war world, the United States and its allies are really the only countries that still operate navies. And so you're not worrying about contesting control of the sea, and so you don't need ships like battleships anymore, especially since they're so expensive. And so we had a couple generations of historians that read these initial reports that were extremely biased towards carriers and submarines for funding reasons, and have continued to pass that off as common knowledge. However, now 80 years removed, we live in an era where historians are starting to reevaluate that. And there is now a debate going on in the historic community, once again, over whether battleships were made obsolete by aircraft carriers or not. Perhaps at the forefront of this debate is the historian Bob Lundgren, whose book Battleship Victory argues much of his thesis. Essentially, that battleships can control a sea zone and deny that zone to the enemy. And the battleships operated as giant siege engines, which would siege the various Pacific atolls, preventing the Japanese from being able to resupply them. Without a larger navy to be able to force the American battleships off of the gun line around these atolls, those garrisons would eventually fall. They could not be resupplied, and so it was only a matter of time. Most of the great carrier battles, like Midway or the battles off Guadalcanal or the Philippine Sea, after a single day or possibly 2 days of fighting, the carriers, even of the force that won the battle, have attrited their air groups so much that they have to pull back out of the battle space, so they cannot control those sea zones. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the US Navy absolutely destroys Japanese carrier aviation, but the entire fleet turns around and pulls back because they were afraid of a Japanese surface attack. They could not control that sea zone. Carriers can sink battleships, but it requires a disproportionate amount of force to do that. Keep in mind that October of 1944 was the last time that battleships fought battleships and carriers fought aircraft carriers. And April of '45 was the last time that carriers ever attacked a battleship underway. For the last 80 years, we haven't had a true naval war with capital ships fighting each other. And so it's been difficult to argue against the supremacy of the aircraft carrier. However, think about a potential future naval war where supercarriers have to project across the Pacific Ocean and fight contested island invasions again, particularly with long-range cruise missiles defending those islands. Can the carriers control the sea zones around those islands? I don't believe they can. Can submarines control those sea zones? No, they can deny those sea zones to the enemy, but they can't control them themselves. Can existing surface ships like cruisers and destroyers control those sea zones? Probably not. They just can't take a hit. And so that's why I would argue, and some other far more prominent historians than myself would argue, that carriers never rendered battleships obsolete. If you're interested in reading more about this theory, be sure to check out Robert Lundgren's book, Battleship Victory. He explains it a lot better than I can. But also, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Be interested in hearing if you think that battleships have been rendered completely obsolete by aircraft carriers, if they're rendered obsolete by other factors, or if they're not obsolete at all. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. In particular, for this video, we'd like to thank Magic Spoon for sponsoring us. Remember to go to magicspoon.com/battleship or the link in the description below and use the code BATTLESHIP for $5 off your next purchase. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about us and the channel. Thanks for watching.